Peace be upon you, young men. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. Praise be to God, and peace and blessings be upon the messenger of God. O God, there is nothing easy except what you make easy, and you make sorrow easy if you will. O God, teach us what benefits us, and benefit us with what you have taught us, and increase us in knowledge. O God, make all our deeds purely for your noble countenance, and do not let anyone else have any part in them. O Lord of the worlds, this is the third session on the Prophet's biography, which we ask God Almighty to make a guide for us to reform our current reality. As I mentioned, we do not study the biography to enjoy or take pleasure in hearing the story, but rather to try to draw inspiration from it and apply it to our contemporary reality. Of course, we are now in the midst of the heated events taking place in Gaza, so perhaps we will have a better understanding of the importance of capitals, the issue we discussed last time. No doubt you remember how, when Cairo, the Egyptian capital, was in the hands of its people, or rather, in conflict between its people and the old regime during the 2 years following the revolution, the Egyptian position was completely different. This had a widespread impact throughout the Islamic world, including Gaza. Gaza breathed a sigh of relief, received weapons, and gained political support. Even I myself met people from East Turkestan, the far east of the Islamic world, and people from the remote areas of Africa, in countries where we hadn't even heard of Muslims. All of them were affected. By this period, their circumstances improved significantly, including those in Turkestan. I even found some Muslim minorities in Europe. One of the most surprising things I discovered was that, even for the detainees in Guantanamo, these years were a golden age for them, in terms of the treatment they received from the American guards, the improved conditions, and even the prisoner exchange deal, which only took place after the revolution. In any case, the point is that, regarding the issue we discussed last time, we should now be the best people to understand them, because ultimately, if we want to reform the nation, we certainly can't approach every single one of the 2 billion people to try and convince them. There are key points to consider, and the handles and centers of this body. If it is sound, the whole body is sound. This meaning was found among scholars when they explained the hadith of the heart, the hadith of Nu'man ibn Bashir, may God be pleased with him. Indeed, in the body there is a morsel of flesh which, if it is sound, the whole body is sound, and if it is corrupt, the whole body is corrupt. Many scholars mentioned in their explanations of this hadith, and it is agreed upon in Bukhari and Muslim, that people follow the religion of their rulers. If the ruler is sound, the rest of the subjects are sound, and if he is corrupt, the rest of the subjects are corrupt. The ruler is to the subjects as the heart is to the body. And I missed mentioning in the last lesson another matter concerning Mecca. I mentioned why the Prophet was sent to Mecca, and we mentioned that Mecca was the capital of the Arabs, and that the Arabs were greatly influenced by what happened in Mecca, and that almost the entire prophetic biography was a struggle for control of Mecca. The Prophet spent most of his time during the Meccan period trying to convince the Quraysh leaders, because if they converted to Islam, Mecca would convert, and the Arabs would follow them. The entire Medinan period was a period of the conflict with Mecca, and the moment when the Meccan state, in our modern terminology, the Islamic state, recognized Islam at the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, was a clear victory. What I neglected to mention is that idol worship originally spread throughout the Arabian Peninsula from Mecca. The leader of Mecca, Amr ibn al-Hayy al-Khuzai, went to Syria during the Khuzar tribe's control of Mecca. He saw its fertility and observed it, and the people there suggested to him that the fertility and beauty of gods. Syria was under the control of the Roman Empire, which was a pagan state. We will discuss this further today, God willing. So, he took an idol and returned with it, setting it up in Mecca. From here, the distortion of Abraham's religion began in the Arabian Peninsula, and from Mecca, idol worship spread throughout the peninsula. The idea that effectively controls the capital resonates in the rest of the regions, even the deserts. Even if one of you grew up and lived in a village or in an extreme environment, he will see how the capital always imposes its ideas more than the region imposes its ideas on the capital. For example, if immodesty increases in the capital and the veil increases in the village over time, who will prevail? Will the city and the capital be veiled, or will the village be the one that adopts immodesty? Okay, the city has family disintegration, the father rebels against his father and the daughter against her father and mother, or there are many cases of divorce, but the village is cohesive. Okay, over time, who is influenced by whom? The village, the city, and the outlying areas are affected by what happens in the capital. Therefore, one of the most important means of change is to always seek impactful change, influential centers, and influential capitals in our Islamic world. This is a continuation of what we said last time. The second point I missed in the episode before last, which was in the first session, was that some friends pointed out I mentioned the noble lineage of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. We talked about Qusay ibn Kilab, Hashim, and Abdul Muttalib, but we forgot to mention Abd Manaf. We mentioned that the Prophet was the son of Abdullah ibn Abdul Muttalib ibn Hashim ibn Abd Manaf ibn Qusay. You will understand this now. This Abd Manaf, who was the son of Qusay and the father of Hashim, was mentioned by biographers and historians as having risen to prominence and leadership during his father Qusay's lifetime. That is, towards the end of his father's life, leadership passed to Abd Manaf, even though he wasn't Qusay's eldest son. Qusay's eldest son was named Abd al-Dar, and from him the Banu Abd al-Dar, who would carry the banner, mentioned that Abd al-Dar was weak and lacked sound judgment, meaning he was not honorable, while his younger brothers prevailed, with Abd Manaf leading them. His father, Qusay, entrusted him with significant responsibilities: the chamberlainship, providing food and water, and carrying the banner, so that he would be on par with his sons. If he had left matters to the natural competition among them, the eldest, Abd al-Dar, would have lost his influence and status. Therefore, he gave him these important positions of honor in Mecca, balancing his worth with that of his brothers, who naturally held power, including Abd Manaf. For this reason, historians mention that Abd Manaf was the one who established the quarters in Mecca. In modern terms, we could say he built the new Mecca, the new republic, like the one we have in Egypt. We mentioned that Qusay transformed Mecca from a village into a city and organized its commercial system. We also mentioned that Qusay's son said, "There is a religion in Quraysh that is complete." Thus, the administrative or urban organization was born in Mecca. His father's life and the establishment of this organization were under his protection. If we examine the lineage of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, we find that each member of his lineage had a significant impact on life in Mecca, making him a noble and distinguished figure. His lineage is complete, and he was nicknamed Abd Manaf, and he was called the moon for his beauty, a poet of that split open and the yoke was purely Abd Manaf. He meant that if Quraysh was like a jewel, its origin, marrow and center was Abd Manaf. This is something I forgot to mention. Now we are approaching the birth of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, so we should take a general look at the state of the world when he was born. This question leads to another. If the world at that time was in a state of profound ignorance, why did God Almighty choose the Arabs from among this ignorance to send his prophet, peace and blessings be upon him? Let's start by looking, for example, at the Romans. The word Romans means Westerners, or in our modern understanding, Westerners, who are now Europe, America, and Australia. At that time, the people of America and Australia, meaning our people, had not yet discovered these regions. But of course, the Americans, or Westerners, migrated from Europe and displaced the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas and Australia. This is what became known as the Roman Empire in our modern reality, or what the international community is now. The international community consists of North America, Europe, Australia, and sometimes Japan, though Japan was never part of the Roman Empire. This Roman Empire, which encompassed almost all of Europe, split into the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, and the Western Roman Empire, with its capital in Rome, Italy. This division, over time, became a fundamental, deep, and significant one. Thus, we are faced with the Eastern Roman Empire, also called the Byzantine Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, now Istanbul, its language Greek, and its religion Orthodox Christianity. On the other hand, there was the Western Roman Empire, with its capital in Rome, its religion Catholicism, and its language Latin. This division, a huge division, persists to this day. For example, anyone who has read Samuel Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations, will see that Huntington doesn't consider Eastern Europe to be part of the West. By the West, he means Western Europe, which is an extension of the Catholic religion, later divided into Protestantism, and of the Latin language, which branched into English, French, German, Italian, and Spanish. This is a distinct civilization, unlike the Eastern civilization, which he calls the tripartite civilization, represented today by Russia and its surrounding regions in Eastern Europe. It's clear that, during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the Eastern Roman Empire maintained its strength and power, while the Western Roman Empire was fragmented and threatened by the invasion of northern tribes. These northern tribes, which are now the peoples who migrated from Germany, Sweden, and Norway, invaded Rome, and all of Western Europe was plunged into chaos. Therefore, when the companions asked the Prophet, peace be upon him, O Messenger of God, which of the two cities will be conquered first, Constantinople or Rome? He said his city was Constantinople, which was Heraclius's. This was something astonishing to the companions, because it was easier at that time to conquer Rome, as Rome was in a state of utter chaos, but Constantinople was in a state of strength, civilization, and prosperity. And indeed, what the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said came to pass. even though it seemed far-fetched at the time. So, when we talk about the Romans during the time of the Byzantine Empire, whose capital was Constantinople, whose leader was Heraclius, whose language was Greek, and whose religion was Orthodox Christianity. So, this is how the Roman Empire lived. Of course, those of you who enjoy watching foreign films will surely find that one of the most prominent aspects was slavery, and how the kings treated people as slaves. It was even one of the entertainments that the public and the king enjoyed, how slaves would fight each other in front of him until they killed each other, or how they would throw a slave to the ground. The lion struggles for the Roman Empire contained the most insidious human atrocities, the extreme slavery that reduced the slave to a mere instrument of entertainment, stripping him of his autonomy and making his sacrifice or killing a trivial matter, since he was simply a slave. Yet, this Roman Empire was also characterized by extreme materialism, luxury, and extravagance, particularly the lavish lifestyle of the kings. Of course, when you hear of the king's extravagant lifestyle, you must immediately contrast it with the people who struggled to pay taxes. Where would the kings get their money from? What the people produced. Therefore, when you observe the lives of the wealthy, you find them to be extravagant and indulgent, filled with desires. One of the prevalent phenomena of that time was the love of celibacy and the aversion to marriage. You know that in any lustful society, or any society dominated by desire, marriage is inevitably delayed and diminished. This is a fundamental principle of human society, because marriage is a responsibility. A man's responsibility involves caring for his wife and children. But for someone who only wants to satisfy his desires, this is certainly not the right choice. Therefore, one of the important things that many modern women don't realize or imagine is that marriage is a protection for women before it is for men. If we weren't Muslims, we would think that marriage is a feminist conspiracy against men. Because a man doesn't bear any responsibility. If a man isn't obligated to care for his wife and children, he can satisfy his desires and leave. Who suffers during pregnancy and childbirth, even suffering psychologically, emotionally, and physically? It's the woman. If we weren't Muslims, we would think that marriage is a conspiracy by women against men. One of the phenomena that spread in the Roman Empire at that time was materialism, lust, and a low marriage rate. This is a phenomenon prevalent in all civilizations that lean towards materialism, as is prevalent now in Europe. Of course, you all know about the percentage of illegitimate children, divorce cases, and the decline in marriage rates. And now it has become very common in European and American countries for couples to cohabit and live together without a marriage contract. One of the most famous football players, you all know him, has 4 children, but he doesn't intend to get married. I also heard about another Moroccan player. Anyway, I don't want to get into this story now. The conclusion is that as long as society leans towards materialism and hedonism, it will distance itself from marriage and from raising children, and this is a harbinger of the collapse of societies. A second thing is, if we look at the Roman Empire religiously, we will find that you hear the term Byzantine debates. What does Byzantine debates mean? These are the sterile, unproductive, unimportant, and ineffective arguments known as Byzantine arguments. This is because the state of Orthodox Christianity at that time was characterized by debates about religion. The truth is that Christ was obscured by Paul and became even more obscured when Constantine adopted it. Constantine, the Roman emperor, embraced Christianity and it began to spread from him because it became the official state religion. However, because he wanted to reconcile the pagan population with Christianity, he began to incorporate elements from paganism into Christianity, mixing them together until Christianity, which was originally a monotheistic religion, became a religion full of statues and images. As Judge Abdul-Jabbar says, the Romans did not convert to Christianity, but Christianity became Romanized. That is, the influence of paganism and Roman customs on Christianity was stronger than the influence of Christianity on Roman customs, behavior, and character. This is completely different from what Islam brought, which transformed the lives of the Arabs and made them followers of another religion. They entered it entirely. Therefore, this distribution, this mixing between paganism and Christianity, and this complex idea of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and which came first, and whether the divine and human natures are united or separate and reunited, and whether Christ has one nature, divine and human, or a divine nature into which the human nature is dissolved. All of this, my friends, was a subject of discussions, disagreements, wars and massacres. These issues were among the things that ignited wars, massacres, and conflicts, especially between the Church of Constantinople and the Egyptian Church, the Coptic Church of Egypt. If I were to draw a comparison, I mean a far-fetched one, but I'm trying to approximate the picture. It's similar, for example, to the Salafist state, which refuses to budge from its beliefs, not even by half a millimeter or a quarter of a millimeter. So, no matter how much the Church of Constantinople tried to advance, it believed that Christ had two natures, a human nature and a divine nature. I apologize, my friends. As for the Egyptian Church, it believed that Christ had one nature. It is a divine nature, and human nature has dissolved into it until it has vanished. That is, there is no longer a human nature. This conflict led to 2 centuries of struggle, strife, problems, massacres, and wars. Egypt at that time called its era the era of martyrs, especially during a period of 10 years when one of the governors sought to eradicate the doctrine of the Egyptian Church. Egypt, as part of the Eastern Roman Empire, suffered 2 forms of oppression simultaneously. Religious oppression, which was an attempt to force it to adhere to the doctrine of the Church of Constantinople, and political oppression, because Egypt was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. Egypt, being the land of the Nile, and because of its fertile land, was always important to every empire it was part of. The people of Egypt at that time suffered both religious and political oppression. Religious oppression in this sense, because they even destroyed the Coptic Church, and the Egyptian priests fled to monasteries in the mountains, and the Christian monasteries still exist. It was widespread in the mountains and remote deserts, and the great patriarch of Christianity was a fugitive wandering aimlessly because as soon as he discovered that this was contrary to the correct doctrine from the point of view of Constantinople, he would be tortured by burning, by drowning, meaning that he would be placed, for example, in sacks filled with sand and then thrown into the sea, by cutting up meaning that it was one of the most severe and heinous errors that existed at that time. In addition to that, this Eastern Roman Empire was the this is the remaining image of Christianity. This is the place where the remnants of revelation are located. It is imagined that this was the best place in the world at that time in this form, which was dominated by arguments, lust, and political persecution. We go to Persia. The Persians also worshipped fire. You know that Zoroastrianism was widespread among the Persians, and they worshipped fire. They also had this same class system, a class system that meant that Khosrow had royal blood. This royal blood is different from the blood of the rest of the people. It is blood emanating from God. Therefore, this Khosrow was a holy man, and the nobles who came after him were considered great men by those who came after them. The rest of the people were the ones who paid taxes, gave money, and endured persecution. But even these great men surrounding Caesar were not allowed to sit in Caesar's presence, meaning Khosrow's. They had to stand. In fact, the Persians were not allowed to utter the name of Khosrow because this was a desecration of his name. From this, you understand that when the Persians lost their strong personality, the one who could rule, they lost theirs. They would bring a young child from the lineage of Khosrow to rule, for he was the one with the noble royal blood. If they could not find a child, they would bring a woman, as was the case with Buren, the daughter of Khosrow, and as was her sister before her. This is where the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said, "A people who entrust their affairs to a woman will never prosper." Herein lies the disagreement among some scholars regarding the issue of a woman's leadership. Was the Prophet's statement general, or was it related to a specific incident? This is a matter of jurisprudence, which we will not delve into here. Therefore, Khosrow ruled the Persians. Persians had this same class system, oppressing the peasants and forcing them to worship fire. This was widespread. In Persia, the Persian Empire was a powerful and vast empire, stretching from Afghanistan and the borders of China to, at times, even approaching Constantinople. At its height, it controlled the Levant and Egypt. It was not a weak state, it was a large and powerful empire in which conflicting religious doctrines emerged. So, if we are talking about their conditions regarding religion, we will see that their origin was fire worship, and this fire worship originated from a philosopher, perhaps a prophet, or perhaps someone who claimed prophethood for himself, namely Zoroastrianism, well known in Persian tradition. However, as we approach the birth of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the point we want to focus on here, we will see that communism spread among the Persians. This communism, theorized by Marx and implemented by Lenin, had an ancient origin with a philosopher named Mazdak, to whom Mazdakism is attributed. This man was a reaction to a man before him named Mani. Mani believed the world was corrupt and thus embraced monasticism, isolation, and renunciation of marriage. He said the world is inherently corrupt, and we must help it rid itself of itself. We must hasten its destruction. Consequently, he advocated against marriage, called for monasticism, and urged the reduction of all things. Mazdak killed him. This was a reaction to Mani's idea, as he said, no, the root of corruption and evil in the world is monarchy. I have a house and I don't. You have a wife and I don't. You have children and I don't. So, what's the solution? Professor Mazdak, the solution is to abolish private property, so that all existing wealth belongs to everyone. Of course, this is the communist idea, which I'm saying sarcastically now, but when it emerges in a class based society, pay attention. Every idea that has prevailed must have contained some truth and was a response to certain motivations within its society. So even if the lecturer or speaker presents the idea sarcastically, you shouldn't receive it in that same sarcastic way. Any idea that has succeeded must have had some motivations and contained some truth. What made communism a viable idea in the first place? Even contemporary communism, what made it so? Because there is a huge class disparity. There are wealthy people and destitute people. Some own palaces, money, and rivers, while others don't have enough to eat. Some enjoy hundreds and thousands of women and concubines, while others can't even afford to marry, even if it's just one wife. Some people live in prosperity and luxury, while others can't find decent housing. Mazak, of course, was a strong and charismatic figure. He spread the idea of communism. This communist ideology appealed to people, as we said, who were suffering from poverty and need. The most important thing Mazdak did was convince Khosrow I, the ruler of Persia, of this idea, the idea of communism. It was strange, very strange, that an emperor, the owner of vast estates, would be convinced of a communist idea. As soon as he was convinced and began to spread it, the kingdom descended into chaos. Every communist group would attack the house they liked, take the money they liked, and enslave the women they liked. Soon, a man wouldn't recognize his own children, and things became chaotic, because men began to seize their possessions and their wives. Mazdak even went so far as to tell Khosrow I that he couldn't be loyal to this idea unless he gave up his wife, the queen, to we enjoy it, and this is the true application, right? Therefore, his son, Anushirvan, who later became Khosrow after him, of course, the accounts differ on what happened, but the famous account is that Anushirvan pleaded with Mazdak to exempt his father from this religious duty, and he persisted until he finally did. But Anushirvan insisted and harbored within himself that if God had given him power, he would kill him. And indeed, as soon as Kavad I died and Anushirvan took over, the first thing he did was kill Mazdak and persecute the Mazdakites. Mazdak died only half a century before the birth of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, or 40 years, depending on the account. We mentioned that the Prophet was born on April 20th, 571, so Kavad died either in 521 or 531, depending on the account of historians. So, if we mention that the Persian Empire had this class system, this injustice in governance, fire worship, and even these corrupt doctrines. And regarding the class system, of course, I mentioned even the highest-ranking officials couldn't sit in the presence of Khosrow, nor could they speak on his behalf. We will see and understand this, young men, when we come to the story of the Islamic conquests. If you recall the famous incident we all remember, the incident of our master, Rabbi Ibn Amir, entering upon Rustam. Rabbi Ibn Amir was one of 3 ambassadors. A second ambassador was our master Al-Mudhar ibn Shubayr. When Al-Mudhar ibn Shubayr entered upon Rustam, he entered in a manner similar to that of Rabbi ibn Amir. But, as the narration tells, when Rabbi ibn Amir saw Rustam before him, he sat. Guards rushed upon him and dragged him away, and in Tabari's words, they tartarahu, meaning they made him sit on the ground. He said, the Arabs are a people who do not enslave one another unless one is at war with them. Meaning, when Arabs sit, they don't have this class system. Whoever sits on the same mat and the cushion on which his Arab companion sits, unless we enslave one another. And I have learned that your kingdom is in decline, for no nation will triumph if its people enslave one another. This means a scene from which you can glean how Rustam was. This was not from the royal family. He was their military commander, the army commander. He wasn't from the royal family at all. But this points to and draws our attention to the class system that was prevalent at that time. Now, if we leave the Persians and go, for example, to India. India, my friends, had what? It had the strangest, ugliest, and most heinous system you could ever hear of. Of course, our knowledge of Indian history goes back to the Indian Muslim scholars, foremost among them Sheikh Abu al-Hasan al-Nadwi. May God have mercy on him. He mentioned this in his book, What the World Lost Due to the Decline of Muslims, which is an important book. In What the World Lost Due to the Decline of Muslims, Abu al-Hasan al-Nadwi says that we can summarize the state of India before the birth of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, in 3 matters. The first matter is the rampant idolatry. He mentions that India had millions of idols. Everything could be considered a god, from the first idols, and of course idols. You've probably heard of some Indian movies, from small to large to medium-sized idols, idols of men, idols of women, idols of animals. What are we facing? An open-air museum of idols, and beyond idols, stones and wood. Everything can be worshipped like mountains. Mountains by God, mountains. Legend says that a prophet lived in this mountain, or a saint lived in it, or a revelation descended upon it, or so-and-so wrote the holy book there. Mountains, rivers. This river is where the saint bathed, and this river sprang from the saint's mouth. And this river is where the saint sat on its banks. Rivers, celestial bodies, stars, the sun, the moon, planets, Saturn, animals, mice, spiders, cats, dogs, and of course, cows, the most famous object of worship in India. So, the important thing is the means and tools, even pens, books, plows. All these things symbolize good. For example, a plow symbolizes good, and therefore it is a source of good, so we worship it. Why did they worship the cow? Because the cow is a symbol of giving. Of course, they don't eat its meat, but it gives them milk, so it is a symbol of giving. Therefore, they worship it, even worshiping each other. So, everyone who likes something, there is no problem with him. worshipping it. The important thing is that we have the highest degree of freedom in the matter of choosing a god. Whatever someone likes, he worships it. This is called tyrannical idolatry. And of course, Sheikh Abu al-Hassan al-Nadwi mentioned a number that I still cannot comprehend. He mentioned that there were million idols in India. So, I don't know if this was intentional or a typo, I don't know. But the important thing is that tyrannical idolatry made India a stage for idols. He says that India, we summarize it in three things: tyrannical idolatry, tyrannical lust, and tyrannical lust. What is Of course, when the number of deities increases, my good people, what is this deity? Every deity has a story behind it that made it a deity. There is no one. God forbid, but what I want to say is, if someone wants to kiss this box of tissues, he will not say, I liked it and that's it. What is there? There must be a story behind it that makes it sacred. So, since we have millions of deities, we have what? Millions of stories. Sheikh al-Nadarwi also mentions that many of these stories were stories contrary to morals, which cannot be told neither in study gatherings nor in women's gatherings. Even the news of the gods and the conflicts of the gods, and the attempts of the gods to kidnap each other. These huge stories, a large number of them are stories that are contrary to morals and which always ignite and arouse desires. He says, and this has an effect on the minds, imaginations, and nerves of even the religious. When the priest is the one who tells you these contrary stories, do you imagine what the behavior of this priest will be? How will he treat people, boys, girls, and women? He says, therefore, the temples of Hindu religion were houses of vice where the student found his desire and the libertine found his request. If this was the case in the houses of religion that should be places of remembrance of God, then how can you imagine that the matter was in the palaces of kings and princes? He means that there was a huge state of permissiveness and depravity that existed at that time. The third element is the extreme class system. We said India, he summarized it in three elements: the multitude of idols, the tyranny of unbridled lust, and the extreme class system. Because India contained the most abhorrent class system, India's law divided people and the masses into four classes. The first class is the class of Brahmins. The Brahmins are the religious men, the priests, and these were created from the mouth of God. What is their function? Their job is to read the Bible, memorize the Bible, offer vows to the gods, receive alms, and legislate laws. They have no rights over anyone. They are the ones who have rights over people. They do not pay taxes. If one of them deserves to be killed, his hair must be shaved. This is the superior, distinguished caste that has all the advantages and is not subject to the laws. The second caste is the caste of men of war. These were created from the arm of the gods. The first ones were created from the mouth of the gods. They came down a little in the caste in rank, so they were created from the arm of the gods. Yes, these are their job. Their job is protection, guarding, and serving the Brahmin caste. Third class. These are the class of farmers and merchants, and these were created from the lineage of the gods. They descended in holiness a little more. Their job is to take care of money, trade, land, and animals, meaning to do the things and serve the first and second classes. This is their job, and the Last class is a class called the toter. What was this class created from? From the feet of these gods. Why were they created? They created these three classes for service, but who will serve them? These people were created for service, and they must know that their happiness lies in serving the higher classes. No one should aspire to anything above their station. Those in the fourth class shouldn't think about trading or making a living to reach the third because they were created to be servants. Similarly, those who farm and trade aren't allowed to think war. The law states that a 10-year-old child of the Brahmin caste, the elite class, is superior to a man of the war caste, the second class, and even to a 100-year-old man of the war caste. So a 10-year-old child is better than a 1-year-old man of the second caste. A father is also superior to his son. This last caste has many punishment clauses. For example, if someone touches the hand of a Brahmin, or a child's hand touches a Brahmin, their hand is cut off. If they speak to them, their tongue is cut out. If they say they were directing them, for example, I imagine, based on the law, that if one of the Brahmin servants, for instance, were caring for a child, I mean, one of the servants caring for a child of an Abrar, and the servant said to him, for example, you'll fall, don't go this way or that way, and if he claimed to be guiding him, he would be given boiling oil to drink, and if he thought of sitting in his presence, his buttocks would be branded. This man from this class is treated like a crow, an owl, a mouse, a spider, or a dog. This is the state of India, of course, my dear friends. I remind you of what we mentioned earlier. We cannot know the Prophet's favor upon the worlds unless we understand the state of the world without the Prophet. Peace and blessings be upon him. And even at this moment, as we speak, the world still suffers from other atrocities, but we don't have time to list them now. Perhaps we will come to them another time. Let's go to the Arabs. The pre-Islamic Arabs also had a rampant idolatry, but of course not to the same extent as the Indians. But the Arabs also had a god for each tribe and a god for each household. And if they went out on a journey, and the narration, the story is a beautiful and thought-provoking tale. They say that when a man went on a journey, he would choose 4 stones, take the best one and worship it, and use the other 3 as firewood for his hearth. Notice the difference. Either it becomes a god, or it becomes just a stone in the hearth. Arabs also had many idols and many objects of worship. They sometimes worshipped jinn, some worshipped the celestial bodies, some worshipped the sun, and some worshipped the moon. The Arabs also possessed pre-Islamic traits, which are remnants of human arrogance and tyranny. You know the wise Arab poet, Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma. He was called the wise poet because many of his odes are full of wisdom. He is the same one who said, "He who does not defend his watering place with his weapon will have it destroyed, and he who does not wrong others will be wronged." So, if you are an Arab, you have 2 choices. Either you wronged others or you are wronged. This meaning was later echoed by al-Mutanabi, who said, injustice is inherent in human nature. If you find someone who is chaste, perhaps he wouldn't wrong him. If you find someone who doesn't wrong anyone, even if they have a problem or something we don't know about, and injustice is inherent in human nature, then if you find someone virtuous, perhaps they won't wrong anyone. The Arabs also had this kind of power, but as Sheikh Ismail keeps telling me, time is up. Arabs, my friends, had a form of all these problems we mentioned. They did have paganism, that's true, but it wasn't widespread. They had a class system, differentiating between the noble and the weak, between the free and the slave. They had a class system. They also had injustices, slaves and female slaves. By God, they forced their dealt with each other using usury, exorbitant usury, and this usury could lead to the enslavement of people. If a debtor couldn't repay the debt, he might sell himself or his child, and of course, they had immense injustice towards women. Women in the pre-Islamic era were oppressed. Some were buried alive, perhaps even for girls. Sometimes a man would kill a girl because he feared she would bring shame, and sometimes he would kill a boy because the Arabs sometimes killed their children, either due to poverty or out of fear of poverty due to having many children. If a man inherited from his father, he would also inherit his father's wives. He would either marry his father's wife, or he would marry her off and take her dowry, or he would leave her unmarried, neither allowing her to marry nor marrying her himself. But what concerns us now is that the Arabs, despite all these atrocities from the pre-Islamic era, were far less extreme than those we have mentioned. It is true they had a class system, but it never reached their level of the Persian, Roman, or Indian systems. Hence the saying of Al-Mughira, which we mentioned earlier, that the Arabs do not enslave one another. They did have kings, but their rule was unstable. As we said, the Arabian Peninsula didn't have kings except for brief periods. The kinder tribe emerged in the central part of the peninsula, and kings appeared in the regions bordering Persia, the Romans, among the Lakhmids who were close to Persia, and among the Ghassanids who were close to the Romans. Yet they were not among their people, meaning the Ghassanid kings or the Lakhmid kings with this sanctity or this veneration among their followers, of course, let alone in the heart of the Arabian Peninsula, unless the leader enslaved someone. We mentioned to you in the introductory episode their saying, and days of glory and length. We disobeyed the king, and in them we submitted. And the famous Malarkar of Amr ibn Kulthum, he recited it in the presence of a king, in the presence of Amr ibn Hind, and he says to him, O Abu Hind, do not rush us and wait for us. We will tell you the truth, that we bring the banners red, we bring the banners white, and we send them back red. We have quenched our thirst, and we drink pure water when we come to it, while others drink muddy and turbid water. Look who he is talking to. Of course, we said the one who broke the chain of tyranny. No one mentions his name. So the difference is enormous in what? In the matter of domination and some of the Arabs' morals. This was a kind of exaggeration, recklessness and excess in noble and authentic morals, meaning the morality of violence, the morality of violence. This is a morality of where did he come from? They created courage, but they exaggerated it to the point of injustice. As we mentioned, he who does not wrong others wrongs me. As their poet said, they do not question their brother when he calls upon them in times of hardship, asking for proof of what he says. So, killing and injustice are branches of courage, but they were exaggerated. Even burying daughters alive, for example, is a branch of chastity, where a man doesn't want his daughter to go astray or be shamed later. But it was greatly exaggerated, even to the point of killing her. Arabs were known for their generosity, extreme generosity, as you know. They used to sing the praises of Hatim al-Tai. They were known for protecting their neighbors, fulfilling their obligations, and they gave the example of Al-Samuel. This was a man who lived in a fortress. Imru al-Qais left his family and weapons with him. An enemy of Imru al-Qais came wanting to take these weapons. Imru al-Qais refused. So this enemy seized one of Al-Samuel's sons and said to him, "Either you it leads to the weapons of Imru al-Qais, or I will kill your son." He said to him, "Kill my son, for I will not betray my trust." So he slaughtered him in front. Example of loyalty. That is why the Arabs used to sing about this. Of course, the sky said to itself. He has a poem from the finest of Arabic poetry in which he says, "You taunt us, that our numbers are few. So I said to her, the noble are few, and those whose remnants are like us are not few. People like us are not called few, and those whose remnants are like us are not few." Young men who aspire to greatness and elders, it does not harm us that we are few, for our neighbor is honored, while the neighbor of the many is humiliated. Because we are indeed few, but anyone who enters our vicinity cannot reach him. The love of death brings our lives closer, and their lives are hated, so they are prolonged, and no leader among us dies a natural death. None of us dies like that in his bed, nor do we seek revenge where his slain one died. That is, no one dies in his bed, nor do we leave the blood of the dead unpunished, nor do we seek revenge where his slain one died. In a famous poem, you can go back to it and read it. You hear the words of Antara, and he, for example, he describes his chastity, saying, "I am a man of generous nature and noble character. I do not follow the stubborn desires of my soul. I may visit a girl in the neighborhood when her husband is present, but if I am fighting in the army, I do not visit her," meaning he might visit his neighbor, for example, if her husband is present. Of course, this was not the custom among the Arabs until Islam introduced it, but he wants to say, "I cannot enter upon a woman unless her husband is present. I may visit a girl in the neighborhood when her husband is present, but if I am fighting in the army, I do not visit her. I lower my gaze if my neighbor appears to me until my neighbor returns to her home. No woman in my land has ever called herself free until I have paid her dowry to her master. I will aid her if she calls for something great and answer her, and I will forgive her for what she does wrong." So, the morals of the Arabs that made them closer to the message of Islam are that morals, I mean, many of the bad morals that were in them were a branch of what? Regarding good morals in the first place, Islam came to rectify these matters. Of course, there is an important point I must mention. Anyone who reads the history of the Arabs during the pre-Islamic era will lament that these people did not embrace Islam, given their perceived honesty, honor, trustworthiness, frankness, and bravery. However, some contemporary researchers, or even some ancient researchers during the era of Arab nationalism, have used the position of the tyrant to beautify the Arabs, thus diminishing the importance of Islam. It is true that the Arabs possessed these good qualities, but they also had other problems and calamities, the most significant being idolatry, as we mentioned. Therefore, the companions described the pre-Islamic era in which they lived. Our master Jafar, yes, well, we will stop here with our master Jafar, God willing, and continue next time. I ask God Almighty to teach us